Hello, this is Margaret Dygas, and this is the introduction to Part 3, our Part 3 chat. I want you to be thinking about Europe in 1600 to 1750, a nice even span of years, but a very turbulent span of years as well. There were Catholics and Protestants at that time, so there wasn't one unified church anymore. It was the age of absolutism, so we had a lot of absolute monarchs like Louis XIV in France. Commerce was on the rise in many places, despite the existence of war and conflicts. There was kind of a beginning of a rise of a middle class, merchant class, people who began to be interested in the arts and in music because they had a little time to think about that. Musicians were employed in many places, courts, in the churches, city-states even hired musicians to perform for state and city functions. And then were professional opera houses for the first time, professional theaters, and these all were venues for musicians to gain employment. Baroque music, the music that was written in this time period, began in one style and ended in quite a different style. But throughout the period of 150 years, there was a constant sense of unity of mood throughout music. So one particular piece of music didn't have lots of different, violently different sections. There was one kind of sense of mood throughout a whole particular piece. There was a sense of continuity of rhythm, so that if a piece began with a certain kind of a rhythmic pattern, that pattern tended to be kind of worked out and explored and used all the way from beginning to end. There was a continuity of melody where long themes were developed and main ideas repeated, so that melody became something that was constant throughout these particular pieces. Dynamics, loudness and softness were a big expressive device, but they were handled kind of in stair steps or terrace dynamics, where things would be at a certain dynamic level and then suddenly softer or suddenly louder with a very distinct kind of plan. And texture during the Baroque period was very interesting. At the very beginning, there was a complete break, in a sense, with polyphony of the Renaissance. Music became homophonic, particularly with the birth of opera and the exploration of recitative, kind of recited singing, very dramatic, very different than what had come before. But later in the Baroque period, particularly the last half of the Baroque period, the polyphonic texture returned and became more important than ever. One important characteristic of all Baroque music, in fact, the one continuous characteristic that you almost would say defines Baroque music, that you know it's Baroque because, is the existence of a part within the music called the basso continuo, or continuous bass. This was written out and was actually assigned to the bass line, perhaps maybe a cello playing that part, or a cello and a string bass sometimes. But there were figures, numbers that accompanied this bass line, and those indicated sort of a shorthand for chords, the chord structure. And that indicated kind of the vertical structure that was going to stabilize the texture. So besides in the Renaissance period, when we had polyphony with horizontal, maybe braiding going on, in the Baroque, we begin to have these vertical pillars that sort of stabilize the texture, vertical pillars of chords and sounds. So the basso continuo was not only the part, the bass line with the chords with it, along with it, but also referred to the musicians who played that part. And typically would be a keyboard player of some kind, or it could be a guitarist or some kind of chorded instrument playing chords, plus a bass line instrument, so a lower stringed instrument or a bassoon or some instrument of that nature. These two instruments together were called the basso continuo, and the musicians playing those two parts together were called the basso continuo. So it's thought of as a unit. You might compare that to the rhythm section in jazz. So the Baroque period, 1600 to 1750, In 1600, the early Baroque period was an age of revolution in music. It can hardly be exaggerated. The genre of opera, sung theater, was invented at that time actually by amateur musicians who were noblemen in Italy. It soon became the province of professional composers and took off, and we still have opera today, the longest running genre in classical music. There was a switch at first, from polyphony to homophony. So there was an emphasis on dramatic singing, a solo voice singing something very emotional with a very simple accompaniment so that all the emotion was expressed through the declamation of the voice, the way the voice would sing the nuances of the text. Later on in the Baroque period, though, polyphony came back, but in kind of a modern dress, so that we had major and minor keys and kind of the sounds of chords that are much like today began to be mainstays in Baroque music. So the later Baroque period became a time where you had not only the polyphony, the weaving or braiding of the horizontal melodies, multiple melodies within a piece, but also the pillars of harmony that we think of today, the chords, the supportive structure in that sense. Monteverdi was a great composer in his own right, Claudio Monteverdi, at the time when he wrote the first great opera. He decided he was going to do that. It was a newly invented genre, but had only really been treated by amateur musicians, music lovers, who were not professional musicians. And he was working at the court of Mantua, somewhat to the north in Italy, and decided that in his context there, that there was the funding from the court to put on the first great opera. So he wrote an opera on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, one of the most famous stories in the ancient Greek literature. And you're going to be having the privilege of hearing Orfeo, singing Tu sei morta, which is the great song in that particular opera that Orpheus sings when he first learns that his beloved wife Eurydice has died. Very emotional, very dramatic moment in the opera. Later on in the later Baroque, one of the most important developments was the rise of instrumental music. And along with this rise of instrumental music to become co-equal in importance with the vocal music was the necessary development of virtuoso soloists. So you began to see particular individuals playing the violin or other instruments who became famous for their incredible skill on those instruments. We saw the establishment of the orchestra for the first time, particularly the string orchestra. Some few woodwinds would be added to it as an optional addition, but at the time of the late Baroque, the string orchestra was really the fundamental group. Then there was the development of the concerto, which was a natural outgrowth of these other two developments, where a skilled virtuoso soloist would play a solo part accompanied with the orchestra behind. And we're going to listen to one of those kinds of pieces, Vivaldi's La Primavera violin concerto, a wonderful piece, and you'll be hearing all three movements. Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the two great giants of the late Baroque. What Palestrina is to 16th century polyphony, Bach becomes in 18th century polyphony. Palestrina's name is associated with 16th century polyphony as though he thought it up, in the same way Bach's name is associated with the 18th century version of polyphonic practice, as though he created it. Now, obviously, these two composers weren't the only ones writing in those polyphonic styles, but they came to be seen as the greatest masters and the most skilled composers within those styles. Bach was also an organ virtuoso. In fact, during his lifetime, that's how he was known, if he was known at all. He was mainly a church musician. He was not at all famous as a composer, because church musicians were supposed to write music for the church services every week. And that's what he did. So it was many decades after his death that he became known actually as a composer. And of course, today his place among the very top composers of all time is completely justified. He worked mainly in Lutheran churches, although he did spend some time at a Catholic court early in his career. And he brought the fugue form to its highest development. We'll be listening to a fugue for organ solo, just organ alone. We'll be listening to the Little Fugue in G minor and get to know what that polyphonic form is about in the 18th century. And he also wrote church cantatas for the Lutherans' worship service. We'll be listening to a couple excerpts from Cantata 140, one of his most famous, where embedded within that whole cantata is a chorale tune, which would sound kind of like a regular hymn tune today. These were very singable tunes, often with folk origins, that were the basis of congregational singing in the Lutheran Church. And Bach's cantatas incorporated these in many ways for his Sunday morning worship service music. And finally, we'll be studying George Friedrich Handel, who was the other great giant of the late Baroque. He was born the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685, and he was actually much more famous during his lifetime than Bach was. He was an international traveler and a performer. He was a skilled composer of opera. He was a practitioner of Italian opera early in his career, wrote many orchestral works, instrumental works as well. But we'll be focusing on his late career in England when he really developed the genre of the oratorio to a very high degree. He found that to be lucrative. He made quite a bit of money doing that in England in the early to mid 18th century. And we'll be listening to a couple excerpts from his very famous oratorio, Messiah. I've got a few tips for you for studying in Part 3. If you haven't hit the wall yet in this course, you probably will in Part 3. The music is longer, it's much more complex, and there's more of it. You'll be doing 5 assignments on Connect with your listening IDs, and you'll also be doing reflective assignment questions on Moodle. So the listening is not just longer, but it's going to be harder, especially those of you who don't have a lot of music background. The forms become much more complicated because composers were developing the scaffolding for much more complex musical ideas. So with all that in mind, there's nothing that you need to be able to know on your own. It's all there in the material you're going to be studying, but you must plan ahead. If you wait to do your assignments until the night before, I can guarantee for Part 3 you won't be able to manage. So start on them early. Get going on them early and really dig in. And I hope you'll enjoy it. This is really begins the great sort of modern period of musical composition, and we begin to hear music that we've actually heard somewhere before, and it's a lot of fun. But before you dive into all that, you'll be doing the chat forum, so look on Moodle and think about the questions I'm going to pose just to get us thinking about the Baroque period.